My son didn't wait for me to die before he started treating my existence like a cluttered closet that needed to be emptied for his upcoming cocktail party. It was a Tuesday in Boston, the kind of gray, biting morning where the mist rolls off the Charles River and clings to the red brick of Beacon Hill like a damp shroud. I was sitting in the morning room of our family mansion, a house I had kept through 3 recessions, and a husband who left me with nothing but a mortgage and a broken heart. I was 70 years old, my hands slightly gnarled from decades of handling delicate manuscripts and heavy archival boxes, and I was holding a small, yellowed slip of cardstock. It was my 1974 Boston Public Library card. To anyone else, it was a scrap of trash. To me, it was a record of the nights I spent in the stacks, working a second job under the table so Julian could go to private school without a single hole in his socks. It was the key to a world that had saved my sanity when I was a young widow, with a crying child and an empty pantry. Julian walked in, the smell of his expensive citrusy cologne, cutting through the faint, comforting scent of old paper and Earl Grey tea. He looked at me, not with the warmth of a son, but with the clinical appraisal of a man looking at a stain on a white carpet. "What on earth are you clutching now, Mother?" he asked, his voice sharp and devoid of the quiet wisdom I had tried to instill in him. Without waiting for an answer, he reached down and snatched the card from my fingers. His eyes darted over the faded blue ink and the frayed edges. A library card from the 70s. "It's important to me. Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding low and fragmented, even to my own ears. "It reminds me of the work I did. It reminds me of how we survived." He let out a short, hollow laugh, the kind of sound a man makes when he's already decided you're a liability. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the card toward the stainless steel trash bin in the corner. I watched, my heart skipping a beat, as it fluttered through the air and disappeared beneath a layer of wet espresso grounds and a crumpled takeout bag. "It's trash, Mother, it's clutter," he snapped, his face hardening into the materialistic mask he wore for his business partners. "I have the Sterling Group coming over tonight to finalize the merger. This house is a historic landmark. It's supposed to look like a museum of success, not a hoarder's nest for a retired librarian. I'm tired of seeing you carry around these rags. It's embarrassing." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black American Express Centurion card. He slammed it onto the mahogany table between us. The heavy metal made a sharp, aggressive clack that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. "Take this," he commanded. "I've authorized you as a secondary user. Swipe it. Buy a new dress that doesn't smell like dust. Buy some jewelry that actually sparkles. Just for God's sake, don't mention the library tonight. Don't embarrass me in front of people who actually matter." I looked at the black card. It was cold, heavy, and utterly soulless. It was a plastic crown he was forcing onto my head to make me presentable for his court. So this is how they repay me, I thought, a sudden cold clarity piercing through the hurt. Did he really think I had become that senile? Did he think a piece of titanium could replace 40 years of blood, sweat, and silence? "You threw it away," I said, my voice barely a breath. "I threw away a piece of paper, Mother." "I gave you the keys to the kingdom," Julian said, checking his gold watch. He was already halfway out the door, his mind already calculating the millions he thought he was about to make. Dress well tonight. Don't be a burden. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the cold luxury of a room that used to feel like home. I looked at the trash bin. My son saw paper. I saw a lifeline. He saw a librarian. I saw an archivist who had spent her life guarding the secret vaults of the state's financial history. He thought he was the one providing for me. He thought he was the master of the house because he had the black card and the loud voice. He had forgotten, or perhaps he never actually cared to learn, that I was the one who had kept the deed to this house in my name when his father tried to gamble it away. He had forgotten that I was the one who had navigated the digital transition of the government's treasury bonds in the 90s. He called me a burden. He called my life trash. I stood up, my knees aching slightly, and walked over to the bin. I didn't care about the coffee grounds staining my fingers. I reached in and pulled out my yellowed library card. I wiped it clean on my silk apron. Julian thought he was throwing away my past. He had no idea that on the back of that card, hidden in a string of embossed numbers he thought were just a serial code, and was the access key to a digital archive he didn't even know existed. A hidden asset that held the true origin of our family's wealth. He wanted a performance tonight. He wanted to show off his success and his charity toward his aging mother. I looked at the black card on the table, then I looked at my library card. The punch had landed and it had pushed me to the bottom. But as I tucked that frayed piece of paper into my pocket, I felt a new rhythm in my heart. The dignity was beginning to rise. "You've forgotten who built this empire, Julian," I whispered into the silence of the morning room. "And tonight, I'm going to remind you." The house I lived in was a monument to a man I no longer recognized. This mansion on Beacon Hill, with its Federalist architecture, its commanding view of the common, and its heavy iron-wrought gates, had once been a sanctuary of warmth. I remember when the air here smelled of beeswax, slow simmered stews, and the vanilla dust scent of the thousands of books I had curated over a lifetime. Now, under Julian's modernization, it felt like a gallery of expensive, jagged glass. He had stripped the mahogany wainscoting and replaced it with stark, sterile white walls. He had traded my comfortable velvet armchairs for avant-garde furniture that looked more like torture devices than places to rest a weary back. He called it minimalism. I called it the erasure of my soul. As I walked through the grand foyer after Julian's departure, my footsteps echoed with a hollow, metallic ring. There were no rugs to muffle the sound, just cold, white marble that bit through the soles of my sensible shoes. I looked at the walls where family portraits used to hang, photos of my late husband, Arthur, and a young, gap-toothed Julian holding a trophy. They had been replaced by abstract canvases of gray and black, art that invited no one in and offered nothing back. This was the cold luxury my son craved. He wanted a home that looked like a boardroom because he had forgotten how to exist in a space that wasn't designed for a transaction. To him, I was the last piece of clutter in his minimalist dream. I retreated to the kitchen, a room that used to be the beating heart of this house. Now it was a stainless steel wasteland of high-end appliances that Julian didn't know how to use. I stood before the trash bin, my hand trembling as I reached in to retrieve that yellowed library card. My fingers brushed against the cold, wet grounds of his imported espresso. The humiliation of it burned in my throat like lye. So this is how they repay me, I thought. the question echoing in the vast, empty kitchen. Did they really think I had become that senile, that I wouldn't feel the sting of being discarded in my own home? I looked at the black card Julian had left on the counter. It glittered under the recessed LED lighting, a sleek titanium symbol of his delusions of power. He thought that by giving me a black card, he was elevating me. He didn't realize he was actually trying to buy my silence. He wanted me to be a well-dressed ghost at his dinner parties, and a prop that proved he was a good son without him having to actually be one. My mind drifted back to the winter of 1985. I remembered the bone-deep exhaustion of working double shifts at the city's central archive. I was a senior librarian, a title that sounded genteel, but involved hauling heavy dust-caked crates of records from damp basements. I did it because the pay was stable, and the pension was a promise of a future for Julian. I remembered one specific Tuesday much like this one, when the heating in our small apartment had failed. Julian was 8, shivering under 3 blankets, trying to do his homework by candlelight. I had taken a second job as a night shift data entry clerk for the treasury, typing endless strings of numbers into early green screen computers until my vision blurred. I lived on black coffee and the sheer, desperate hope that my son would never have to know the weight of a debt he couldn't pay. I had built this empire of ours brick by agonizing brick. I had saved this mansion from the creditors after Arthur died by navigating the complex labyrinth of estate laws that Julian now thought he pioneered. I was the one who had stayed up until 2 a.m. for a decade, ensuring every cent was accounted for and every bond was reinvested. And now Julian treated me like a house guest who had overstayed her welcome. He spoke over me in meetings with his decorators. He referred to my study, the one room filled with the quiet wisdom of my books, as dead square footage. To him, my life's work was a non-performing asset. The contrast was a physical ache. I had sold my time, my health, and my very youth to provide him with a life of ease. I had been the hard-working, self-sacrificing mother who never complained when my shoes leaked in the Boston slush. I had done it all so he could stand tall, but instead of standing tall, he was standing on me. Knowledge and quiet preparation, I whispered, the phrase a mantra from my archival days. Julian valued the black card because it was loud. It was a status symbol you could throw on a table to end a conversation. But he had forgotten that the most powerful tools are often the quietest. I looked at the library card in my hand, now cleaned and tucked safely into my palm. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a hidden asset that represented 40 years of institutional knowledge. Julian saw a relic. I saw a master key, and he thought he was the master of this mansion of cold luxury. He thought he was the one in control because he held the black card and the loud voice. But as I stood in the center of his sterile kitchen, I felt a shift in my spirit. The punch of his disrespect had knocked the wind out of me, but the empathy I once felt for my son was hardening into something else, something sharper. I wasn't a piece of clutter. I was the archivist, and it was time to show Julian that even in a house of glass, the person who knows where the foundations are buried is the only one who is truly safe. The turning point was coming. I could feel it in the silence of the marble floors. I wouldn't embarrass him tonight in front of his partners. Oh no, I would do something much more devastating. I would be exactly who he thought I was, until the moment I decided he no longer deserved to own the ground he walked on. I sat on the edge of my bed, the heavy silence of the mansion pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. In the palm of my hand, the salvaged library card felt unnervingly light, yet it carried the density of 40 years of unvoiced labor. I looked at the coffee stains on my fingers, a badge of the trash my son thought I had become. So this is how they repay me? The question echoed in the cavernous room, bouncing off the stark, white walls Julian had insisted on. Did they really think I had become that senile, that I would forget the texture of the hunger that built this life? My mind drifted back to the winter of 1982. The memory was so sharp I could almost feel the Boston wind biting through my thin wool coat. My husband had been gone only 6 months, leaving behind a trail of gambling debts and a 5-year-old Julian who didn't understand why we were eating cereal dinner for the 4th night in a row. I was a junior archivist then, earning a pittance to categorize the dust of the city's history. I remembered the day the heat was cut off. I had walked 3 miles to the jeweler downtown, my shoes leaking slush, clutching the only thing of value I owned, my grandmother's diamond engagement ring. I remember the way the jeweler looked at me with the same clinical, dismissive pity Julian had used this morning. He offered me $300. It was a robbery, but to me it was a winter coat for my son and a month of electricity. I sold my heritage to buy Julian a future. I didn't stop there. For a decade, I was a hard-working ghost. I worked my shift at the library and then took a second job cleaning the very offices on State Street, where Julian now pretended to be a king. I remembered the ache in my lower back, the way my hands were constantly raw from bleach and cold water. I did it so Julian would never have to see the trash envelope of our bank balance. I shielded him from the struggle, believing that quiet wisdom meant suffering in silence so your child could walk with his head high. But as I looked around this mansion of cold luxury, I realized my sacrifice had been a double-edged sword. I had shielded him so well from the reality of work that he now believed success was a birthright, and that those who labored were merely scenery. To him, my history of work was a quaint story, a dusty anecdote he could trot out at dinner parties to make himself seem grounded before pivoting back to his millions. "It's just paper, Julian," I had told him, but that paper was the only thing I had kept for myself. It was the symbol of the nights I spent in the basement of the treasury, learning the digital codes that were replacing the old ledger books. I had been there for the birth of the system he now used to track his black card spending. I had been the one who ensured the transition was flawless, working until 2 a.m. while Julian was tucked away in a private boarding school I had paid for, with the double shifts and skipped lunches. The self-sacrificing mother was tired. The humiliation of the morning, the flick of the wrist, there's the clatter of the card against the bin, had finally broken the dam. He saw a retired librarian who smelled of dust. He didn't see the woman who had navigated the most complex financial digitization in the history of the state. He didn't see the woman who had legally outmaneuvered his father's creditors to keep this very roof over his head. I tucked the card into my jewelry box, right where the diamond ring should have been. The ghost of sacrifice was done haunting these halls. I was beginning to see Julian not as my son, but as a materialistic antagonist who had mistaken my grace for a lack of gear. He thought he was the master of the house because he had the loud voice and the heavy metal card. He had no idea that the quiet wisdom he despised was the only thing keeping his house of cards from collapsing. The evening air in the drawing room was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the oily hum of delusions of power. Julian had transformed our home into a stage for his ego. The Sterling group was here, 4 men in suits that cost more than my first car, led by a man named Sterling, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. I stood in the corner, dressed in the modest navy silk dress Julian had told me was acceptable. He had tried to give me the black card again before the guests arrived, pushing it toward me like a bribe. I had left it on the dresser. I didn't need his plastic crown. "And this is my mother, Evelyn," Julian said, leading Sterling toward me. His hand was on my shoulder, but it wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a way to keep me in place, like a prop in a window display. She's a bit of a traditionalist. Still thinks the world runs on library books and paper ledgers. The men laughed. It was a disrespectful sound, the sound of people who believe they are the smartest in every room because their bank accounts say they are. "A librarian, eh?" Sterling said, swirling his ice. "The world's moving too fast for books, Evelyn. It's all about high-frequency data and distressed assets now. Your son here is a shark. He's liquidating the old to make room for the new. That's the only way to stay ahead of the merger." Julian beamed. "That's right. We're clearing out the baggage, Sterling. We're going to be lean, mean, and fully leveraged by Friday." My heart skipped a beat. Clearing out the baggage. I looked at Julian, and for a split second, the materialistic mask slipped. He wouldn't look me in the eye. And he was talking about more than just his business assets. He was talking about the house. He was talking about me. He was planning to sell the mansion as part of the merger collateral, the very house that was still legally in my name through a complex trust he hadn't bothered to read in his rush to be modern. "Is that so, Julian?" I said, my voice cutting through the laughter. It was the first time I had spoken all evening, and the clear-headed, sharp tone surprised him. "You're liquidating everything? Even the things you don't actually own?" Julian's face flushed a deep, panicked red. He tightened his grip on my shoulder. "Mother is just joking. She gets a bit confused with the terminology." He turned to me, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Don't embarrass me, Mom. I told you to just be a witness. Go back to your room if you can't handle the conversation." "I can handle the conversation just fine," I said, stepping out from under his hand. I turned to Sterling. "My son has a habit of throwing away things he doesn't understand. He thinks distressed assets are just numbers on a screen. He doesn't realize that some assets have very long memories." Sterling raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the friction. "A feisty one, Julian. You didn't tell us she had teeth." "She's just tired," Julian snapped, his arrogance bubbling over into a frantic sort of anger. "Mother, go. Now." As I walked out of the room, I could hear Julian's voice rising again, spinning his delusions of power to keep his partners interested. He thought he was the CEO of his own life. He thought he had successfully moved me to the sidelines of the boardroom. But as I reached the stairs, I felt the library card in my pocket. Julian and Sterling were talking about buying up debt and leveraging the future. They had no idea that I was the one who had spent 40 years archiving the very bonds they were trying to manipulate. They saw a disrespectful old woman. They didn't see the general partner who was about to call in their debts. The punch had been delivered in front of his peers. The humiliation was supposed to be mine. But as I looked back at the room full of men in suits, I realized the turning point had already happened. Julian had gambled everything on a merger he didn't control, and he had insulted the only person who could save him. So this is how they repay me, I thought, a cold smile finally touching my lips. By trying to sell my house from under me, the ghost of sacrifice was gone. The strategic intelligence was fully awake. I wasn't going to my room to sleep. I was going to my study to work. Julian wanted to talk about liquidating the old. Fine, I would start with him. The silence of a mansion after a predatory party is a heavy, suffocating thing. It waits for the masks to slip so it can swallow the truth. After Julian and his sharks had retreated to their leather-bound dens or sped away in their humming electric cars, I retreated to my study. It was the only room in this Federalist mausoleum that hadn't been curated into a cold, white void. Here the walls were still lined with floor-to-ceiling oak shelves, and the air still held the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper and beeswax. I locked the door, a click that sounded like a final sentence. I sat at my desk, a heavy, scarred piece of mahogany that had belonged to my father, and pulled the library card from my pocket. So this is how they repay me, I thought, smoothing the frayed edges of the card against the green felt of the desk. By assuming my history is as blank as the sterile walls they've painted over my memories. Did they really think I had become that senile, that I would forget the very architecture of the system they now think they've mastered? Julian saw a piece of trash from 1974. He saw a reminder of a mother who smelled of dust. He was so blinded by the glare of his matte black plastic crown that he never bothered to look at the grain of the paper. He never looked at the 16 tiny embossed digits tucked discreetly beneath the signature line, numbers that weren't part of any standard library system. My fingers traced those numbers, memorized over decades of silence. Julian and Sterling talked about high-frequency data and distressed assets as if they had invented the concepts. They didn't realize that in the early 1990s, while Julian was at his expensive boarding school, I wasn't just shelving books. I was a senior consultant for the Treasury Department's Bond Legacy Project. I was one of the 3 architects who moved the nation's wartime and private issue Treasury bonds from rotting paper ledgers into the first secure digital vaults. It was the Y2K transition, before the world even knew to be afraid of it. We needed a way for legacy holders to access their accounts without a paper trail that could be intercepted by the emerging digital vultures. We used physical keys, items so mundane, so worthless, that no thief would ever think to steal them. My key was my 1974 library card. The numbers on the back were an encrypted access code to a series of Tier 1 Treasury bonds, purchased by my father in 1945 and added to by me with every spare cent I earned during those long, double-shift decades. I opened my laptop, an older, heavier model that Julian often mocked as dinosaur tech. My hands didn't tremble now. The low, slow voice of a hurt mother had been replaced by the clear-headed, sharp tone of a strategist. I entered the restricted government portal, a backdoor entrance that only a handful of us still knew existed. The screen glowed, casting a pale light over my face. I typed in the digits from the card. The system hesitated, a digital heartbeat of 60 years, and then the grain of the truth was revealed. The account didn't show trash. It didn't show clutter. It showed a principal balance of $42,850,000. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking in the silence. Julian was currently drowning in a sea of high-interest distressed debt to fund his delusions of power. He was planning to sell this house, my house, to keep his head above water for another month. He thought he was clearing the baggage by discarding me. Knowledge and quiet preparation, I whispered, the words a cold promise to the room. The most enduring assets of all. I looked at the numbers on the screen. Julian had spent his life thinking I was his dependent. He thought his black card was a leash he could use to lead me into the shadows of a condo in the suburbs. He had no idea that I wasn't just his mother. I was his primary creditor. Sterling and his group had been buying up Julian's corporate debt, circling like sharks for the kill. But those debts were being traded on the open secondary market, the very market my treasury bonds were designed to influence. With a few keystrokes, I could move from the library to the boardroom without ever leaving this desk. So you want to talk about liquidating the old Julian? I asked the empty air. You want to talk about non-performing assets? I felt a surge of strategic intelligence that felt better than any apology. The turning point had been reached. I wasn't going to just stop the sale of the house. I was going to buy the air he breathed. I was going to use this trash card to dismantle his arrogance, brick by brick, until he realized that the person he called a burden was actually the only thing keeping him from the abyss. I began the process of liquidation. I didn't move the money to a commercial bank, so I moved it into a private, anonymous holding company I had named Athenaeum, the Latin word for a place of study. The punch of the morning had been a gift. It had stripped away the last of my self-sacrificing hesitation. As I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, moving tens of millions of dollars into my control, I realized that Julian's black card was just plastic. But my library card? My library card was the heaviest thing in this house. I closed the laptop and tucked the card into my jewelry box, hiding it in the velvet slot where my diamond ring used to sit. The ghost of sacrifice had finished her haunting. The archivist was ready for the clash. I would let Julian continue his boardroom fantasies for a few more days. I would let him think the ultimate betrayal was his to commit. But when the time came, I wouldn't just be a witness. I would be the verdict. My kindness was never a doormat, Julian. It was the vault, and you just gave me the reason to lock the door. The blue light of my laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the study, casting long, sharp shadows across the leather-bound spines of books that Julian considered non-performing assets. Outside the heavy oak door, the mansion was silent, a cold tomb of marble and modern art. But inside this room, in the glow of the monitor, a different kind of power was humming to life. A power that didn't require a black card or a boisterous voice in a boardroom. My fingers, though stiff from the evening's chill, moved across the keyboard with a precision that would have terrified my son. Did they really think I had become that senile? I whispered, the words barely a breath. Did they think 40 years of archiving the state's financial soul had left me with nothing but dusty lungs and a small pension? I looked at the salvaged library card resting on the desk. Julian saw a relic of a bygone era. I saw a master key. The 16 digits embossed on the back were more than a serial code. They were the login credentials for a Tier 1 legacy treasury portal, a system I helped build during the great digitization of the 1990s. Julian's black card was a tool of consumption, a heavy piece of titanium that signaled his ability to spend money he didn't truly have. My library card was a tool of ownership. It was the gateway to the digital treasury. I navigated the restricted government interface, a portal hidden behind layers of encryption that the sharks in Julian's boardroom couldn't even fathom. And I entered the code. The system hummed, a digital handshake 60 years in the making. Then the numbers appeared on the screen, scrolling upward like a mountain of gold rising from the deep. $42,850,000. I leaned back into the shadows of my chair, the clear-headed, sharp tone of my thoughts ringing like a bell. 60 years of compound interest. 60 years of Series E and Series G bonds tucked away from the prying eyes of creditors, ex-husbands, and greedy sons. While Julian was buying designer suits to impress men who didn't like him, I was quietly accumulating the very debt that would eventually be used to dismantle him. So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at the glowing balance. By trying to sell the roof over my head while I'm still standing under it. Julian was currently leveraged to the breaking point. I knew the Sterling Group wasn't just interested in a merger. They were vultures circling a dying animal. They had been buying up Julian's corporate notes on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar. They thought they were the only sharks in the water. They had no idea that I was the ocean. I moved with strategic intelligence, initiating the liquidation of a fraction of the bonds, $10 million, moving it into a private anonymous holding company I had established years ago, Athenium Holdings. I wasn't just going to stop the sale of the house. I was going to become Julian's primary creditor. I was going to buy every single distressed asset he had ever signed his name to. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said to the empty room, my voice firm and decisive. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that while you were learning how to spend money, I was learning how to control it. The contrast was staggering. In the morning room, Julian had stood with delusions of power, throwing my library card into the trash like it was a piece of litter. Now that same card was the only thing that could save him or destroy him. I looked at the transfer complete notification on the screen. The funds were now positioned. The turning point had shifted from a possibility to a mathematical certainty. Julian and Sterling were planning to finalize their merger on Friday. They thought that by clearing the decks and liquidating me, they would find their salvation. They would find me instead. I closed the laptop and tucked the library card back into the hidden slot of my jewelry box. The ghost of sacrifice was officially gone. The archivist of the treasury had taken her place. I would play the part of the disrespectful old woman for a few more days. I would let Julian believe I was confused by his terminology. I would let him climb as high as his ego would take him. It would only make the fall more spectacular. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian," I whispered, the closing moral line of my inner dialogue echoing the cold, hard truth of the numbers on my screen. It was the vault, and you just gave me the reason to lock the door. The digital treasury was open. The assets were moved. The archivist was ready. And the sharks in the boardroom were about to find out what happens when you try to swallow the person who owns the water. I watched my son's empire begin to bleed through the very walls he had painted white to hide the history of my heart. The days following the boardroom party were a master class in the theater of desperation. Julian no longer walked through the halls of our Beacon Hill mansion with the rhythmic, arrogant click of his Italian loafers. Instead, his stride was frantic, uneven, the sound of a man trying to outrun a shadow. The mansion of cold luxury had become a pressure cooker. Every time the heavy brass knocker sounded, or the landline, a relic he had forgotten to disconnect, rang, Julian flinched as if he had been struck. I observed him from the shadows of my library, the ghost of sacrifice now fully transformed into the archivist of vengeance. He thought I was checked out, a senile fixture of the furniture, and so he didn't bother to lower his voice. "Sterling, you can't pull the bridge loan now." Julian's voice echoed through the marble foyer, raw and jagged with panic. "The merger is days away. If the secondary creditors see a liquidity gap, the whole thing vaporizes. I just need 48 hours to clear the title on the house. My mother, she's not an issue. I have the power of attorney. The sale is a formality." I sat in my armchair, the salvaged library card pressed against my palm like a talisman. "So this is how they repay me," I whispered to the rows of silent books. "By selling the ground I stood on while I was still breathing. Did they really think I had become that senile, that I wouldn't recognize the stench of a dying dream?" The cracks in the foundation weren't just financial. They were moral. That afternoon, I found a trash envelope left on the kitchen island, a stack of final notices from creditors Julian thought he had hidden. His black card was no longer a symbol of infinite wealth. It was a leash that had run out of slack. He was leveraged to the sky, and the Sterling Group were no longer his partners. They were his pallbearers. Julian burst into the kitchen, looking as though he hadn't slept since the night he threw my past in the bin. He saw me standing near the papers, but he didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. He just saw a burden in his way. "Why aren't you packing, Mother?" he snapped, his voice trembling with delusions of power that were rapidly evaporating. "I told you the condo in the suburbs is ready. This house is sold. The papers are being notarized on Friday. Your 64 square feet of sentimentality and a $10 million deal I need to close to save my life." "You're not saving your life, Julian," I said, my voice adopting that clear-headed, sharp tone that usually made his eyes narrow in confusion. "You're trying to buy back a soul you've already spent. This house belongs to me. Your father and I built this foundation on more than just distressed assets." He let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "You're old, Mom. What do you even know about how the world works now? You spent 40 years in a basement looking at paper. I'm the one in the boardroom. I'm the one with the black card. You're just living here by my grace." I felt the strategic intelligence flare within me, a cold, bright flame. He didn't know that every time he spoke. He was giving me another reason to tighten the noose. My laptop, hidden in my study, was already humming with the news. Athenium Holdings, my company, had just successfully purchased the bulk of Julian's personal debt from a third-party collector. I didn't just own his memories, I now owned his failures. "Your grace is a very expensive thing to maintain, Julian," I replied, stepping closer. "But be careful. Foundations have a way of shifting when the weight becomes too much for the person who built them to bear." He brushed past me, smelling of stale scotch and fear. He didn't notice the way I looked at him, not with the self-sacrificing pity of a mother, but with the clinical detachment of an archivist filing away a closed case. He thought the ultimate betrayal was his to commit on Friday, and he thought he was going to walk me out of this house and into the shadows of a suburban retirement home. He had forgotten the legal truth, buried in the very trust documents he thought he had mastered. He had forgotten that I was the one who had written the conditional clauses. "I may be old, Julian," I whispered as the door to his office slammed shut, "but I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who actually built this empire." The house groaned around me, a settling of stone and wood that felt like an omen. The cracks were wide enough now for me to see the abyss waiting for him. Friday was coming. The boardroom would be his stage, but the script was already written in the grain of a 1974 library card. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian. It was the vault. And in the cracks in your world are the only way I can show you the gold you were never wise enough to deserve." I walked back to my study, my stride firm, my mind a map of the endgame. The ghost was gone. The turnover was minutes away from midnight, and for the first time in a decade, the air in this mansion felt like it finally belonged to me again. The air in the library tasted of old ink and dry rot, a fitting bouquet for the funeral of my son's conscience. Friday morning had arrived with a sky the color of a wet slate, casting a clinical, unforgiving light through the towering windows of our Beacon Hill home. This room, once my sanctuary of quiet wisdom, had been converted into a cold annex of the corporate world. A long glass-topped table now sat where my favorite reading chair used to be, surrounded by men in charcoal suits who looked like they had been carved from the same ice as the sculptures in the foyer. Julian stood at the head of the table, his materialistic hunger vibrating off him in waves. He was adjusting his cufflinks with a frantic energy, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors every few seconds. Sterling was there, leaning back in his chair with a predatory stillness, flanked by a team of lawyers whose briefcases clicked open like the jaws of a trap. "Sit here, Mother," Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth that once existed when he was a boy reaching for my hand. He pointed to a small, isolated chair in the corner, not at the table, but beside it, a spectator's seat. "The notary is on his way. We're just finalizing the transfer of the residential deed to the holding company as part of the merger's collateral. You don't need to say anything. Just be present." I sat down, my spine a straight line of iron. I felt the salvaged library card in my pocket, a small, stiff square of defiance against the cold luxury of the room. So this is how they repay me, I thought, watching Julian hand a thick stack of documents to Sterling. By turning my life's work into a footnote in a contract? Did they really think I had become that senile, that I wouldn't see the ultimate betrayal hidden in the fine print of their greed. Sterling flipped through the pages with a manicured finger. The power of attorney is attached, Julian. I don't want any hiccups when we move to liquidate the primary residence next month. My investors are already asking why we're carrying so much non-performing real estate. It's all there, Julian snapped, his delusions of power flaring as he tried to hide his desperation. My mother signed the POA months ago. She understands that this house is too much for her to manage. She's looking forward to the condo. He didn't even look at me when he lied. He spoke about me as if I were a piece of furniture being moved to a storage unit. The arrogance was a physical weight in the room. He thought that because he had stolen a signature during a moment of physical weakness, that dizzy spell I'd had after working 3 straight nights to help him organize his books, he owned my future. "You're old, Mom. What do you even know about these things?" he had whispered to me earlier in the hallway, his voice a hiss of disrespect. "This house belongs to the business now. You're just living here by my grace. Don't make this difficult in front of Sterling." I looked at the lawyers, their pens poised like silver daggers. They saw a hard-working relic, a woman whose best years were buried in the archives. They didn't see the strategic intelligence that had been tracking every penny Julian had embezzled from the family trust to fund his failing ventures. And they didn't see the digital treasury I had unlocked in the dead of night. "Is everything in order, Mrs. Vance?" one of the lawyers asked, finally glancing at me with a look of bored obligation. "My son seems to think so," I replied, my voice adopting that clear-headed, sharp tone that made Julian's pen hand falter for a fraction of a second. "She's just tired," Julian interrupted, stepping between me and the lawyer. "Let's just get this signed. The merger depends on this title being clear by noon." The betrayal was complete. He wasn't just selling the house. He was selling the very memory of the woman who had sold her own grandmother's ring to keep his belly full. He was selling the library, where I had taught him the value of a story. And he was doing it to satisfy a man like Sterling, who wouldn't hesitate to crush him the moment the ink was dry. Julian picked up the heavy gold pen I had gifted him when he graduated from Harvard, a pen bought with the overtime pay from 3 years of archival consulting. He moved it toward the signature line of the deed transfer. Did he really think I had become that senile? I wondered, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. Did he think I would let him sign away the foundation I built on my hands and knees? He looked at me then, a flash of something, guilt perhaps, or merely the fear of a trapped animal crossing his face. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll be comfortable in the suburbs. No more stairs. No more dust." "The dust doesn't bother me, Julian," I said, standing up. The room went silent. The lawyers looked up. Sterling stopped swirling his scotch. It's the rot underneath it that I find offensive." Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "Mother, sit down. We're in the middle of a closing." "No, Julian," I said, my voice now firm and decisive, filling the library with a power he hadn't heard in years. "We are in the middle of a reckoning." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the library card, setting it on the glass table. It looked ancient, frayed, and utterly worthless. Julian stared at it as if it were a ghost. "You threw this away because you thought it was trash," I said, looking at everyone in the room. "But in the world of archives, the things people throw away are often the only things that hold the truth. And the truth is, Julian, you don't have the authority to sign that document. The ultimate betrayal had reached its peak. He had tried to sell my soul. Now I was going to show him exactly what it cost to buy it back. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian, I said, the closing moral line of my heart finally finding its voice. It was the vault, and I've just revoked your access. The pen hovered over the paper, but Julian's hand was shaking too hard to write. The turnover had begun. The archivist was no longer a witness. I was the judgment. The silence in the library was broken by the sound of a gold pen hitting the glass table, not with the flourish of a signature, but with the hollow, plastic rattle of a man whose world had just suffered a catastrophic loss of pressure. Julian stared at the frayed 1974 library card as if it were a live grenade. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold, professional suspicion. Julian, what is this? Who is Athenaeum Holdings? And why did my office just receive a notification that our secondary debt portfolio was bought out 10 minutes ago by a private treasury-backed entity? I didn't wait for Julian to find his voice. I didn't need his permission to speak anymore. The ghost of sacrifice had been exorcised, and in her place stood the woman who had spent 40 years mastering the very systems these men thought they had invented. The secondary debt was bought because it was distressed. Isn't that the term you use, Sterling? I asked, my voice as sharp and clean as a winter morning in Boston. My son has been very busy. He's leveraged this house, his company, and even his personal reputation to fund a lifestyle that requires a black card to maintain. But he forgot that a debt is a promise, and a promise in the hands of a librarian is a record that never disappears. Mother, be quiet, Julian hissed, his face a mottled mask of purple and white. He lunged for the library card, but I was faster. I pressed my finger onto the 16 embossed digits. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said, the words ringing with a firm and decisive authority that pinned him to his seat. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that while you were playing at being a shark in the boardroom, I was the one who archived the bones of the people you tried to eat. I turned my laptop toward the center of the table. The screen didn't show the sterile minimalist graphics Julian loved. It showed a restricted Treasury Department ledger. The balance, over $42 million in Series E and Series G bonds, glowed like a beacon of justice. Through the access key on this trash card, I continued, looking directly at Sterling's stunned legal team. I have activated a standing order. Athenaeum Holdings, my private trust, has just completed the acquisition of every single personal and corporate liability tied to my son's name. Our Sterling, your firm was more than happy to sell those distressed notes for a 15% premium above market value. My check cleared 3 minutes ago. Julian's breath came in ragged, shallow hitches. You bought my debt? With what? That card is just paper. It is a key, Julian, a key to a vault you were never wise enough to recognize, I replied. I slid a new folder across the glass table. And as the primary creditor of your corporation and the sole lien holder on your personal assets, I am here to exercise my rights. Section 4, Clause B of your own bylaws. In the event of a total debt acquisition by a single entity, The board of directors is subject to immediate dissolution pending a solvency audit. The lawyers began to whisper frantically. Sterling stood up, his face drained of color. He looked at Julian, and then at me, and I saw the moment he realized the shark in the room wasn't the man in the bespoke suit. Julian, Sterling said, his voice cold and devoid of his earlier camaraderie. The merger is dead. I don't partner with men who are owned by their mothers. I'm not owned, Julian screamed, slamming his fists onto the table. This is a trick. She's a librarian. She's 70. She doesn't know how to move that kind of capital. I am the woman who helped build the digital treasury you use every day, Julian, I said, standing tall. The strategic intelligence of my life's work was finally on display. I was moving capital before you knew how to tie your own shoes. You called me a burden. You called my life's work clutter. But it is that very clutter that has just stripped you of your title, your shares, and your delusions of power. I looked at the notary, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. There will be no signing of the deed today. This house is no longer collateral. It is, and always has been, my home. Julian, as of this moment, you are removed from the board of directors. You are no longer the CEO of this company, and you have exactly 1 hour to remove your black card and your arrogance from my property. The turnover was absolute. The boardroom, once a place of cold luxury and predatory whispers, was now a courtroom where the verdict had been delivered. Julian looked around the room, searching for an ally, but Sterling and his lawyers were already packing their bags. They didn't look at him. They looked at me with a newfound, terrified respect. So this is how they repay me, I thought, watching my son crumble into a chair, his head in his hands. No, this is how I reclaim what was never theirs to take. Knowledge and quiet preparation had proven to be the most enduring assets. Julian had the sword, but I had the map. And in the world of high finance, as in the world of archives, the person with the map always finds the treasure and the exit. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian, I said, the closing moral line falling like a gavel. It was the vault, and I've just changed the locks. The silence that followed my declaration was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Julian stood frozen at the head of the glass table, his fingers still twitching near the gold pen. But the man who had occupied that suit 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell, a boy masquerading in the armor of a shark, realizing too late that he had been swimming in a pool owned by the person he tried to drown. Sterling was the first to move. He stood up, not with the predatory grace of a partner, but with the cold efficiency of a liquidator. He didn't even look at Julian. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a reflection of my own strategic intelligence in his eyes, a recognition of power that surpassed a mere bank balance. Julian, Sterling said, his voice like the snap of a winter branch. The Sterling Group does not engage in mergers with companies whose primary assets are held by a third-party creditor, especially one with an outstanding personal vendetta. You lied about the title. You lied about the debt. This deal is not just dead. It's toxic. Sterling, wait! Julian lunged toward him, his face a mottled mask of desperation. We can fix this. She's my mother. I can talk her around. She's emotional. She doesn't understand the impact. I understand the impact perfectly, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through his frantic babble like a diamond through glass. I stood up, my spine straighter than it had been in years. The quiet wisdom that had guided me through 40 years of archival silence had hardened into a crown of iron. I am the one who purchased your impact. I am the one who owns your failure. I walked toward him, the clicking of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a ticking clock reaching midnight. The lawyers scrambled to get out of my way, their briefcases snapping shut in a chorus of dismissal. You told me this morning to buy a new dress so I wouldn't embarrass you, I said, stopping inches from him. You told me the library card was trash. You told me the past was a burden. So let's talk about the present. I reached out and held out my hand, palm up. The card, Julian. Give it to me. What? He stammered, his eyes darting toward the black titanium card sitting next to his smartphone. The black card, I said, my voice firm and decisive, vibrating with the power of a woman who had finally stopped being a sacrifice. The plastic crown you tried to buy my dignity with. It was issued against the very corporate accounts I now control as your primary creditor. It is no longer active, and as of this second, you are no longer authorized to use it. With a trembling hand, Julian picked up the heavy matte black card. He looked at it as if it were a limb he was about to lose. For a moment, the materialistic delusion flickered in his eyes, the belief that as long as he held the card, he still held the power. Then he looked at me. He saw the archivist who knew every secret. He saw the hardworking mother who had finally stopped carrying his weight. He dropped the card into my palm. It was cold and heavy, a piece of dead metal. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said, loud enough for Sterling and the departing lawyers to hear. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that a house built on the betrayal of a mother is a house built on sand. I turned to the lead lawyer. As the majority debt holder, I am exercising my right to an immediate freeze on all corporate spending. Julian Vance is hereby removed from the board of directors, effective immediately. His access to the building on State Street is revoked. His company car is to be returned by sunset. And this house. I looked around the room at the white walls that had tried to erase my history. This house is no longer for sale. Mom, please, Julian whispered, his delusions of power finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He looked small. He looked like the child who used to hide in the library when he broke something expensive, hoping I wouldn't notice. You can't do this. I'll have nothing. I'll be a laughingstock. You already are, Julian, I said, and the choking sorrow I expected to feel was replaced by a profound, soaring sense of liberation. But at least now you'll have the opportunity to earn your own way. You wanted to liquidate the old? Well, the old has decided to liquidate your arrogance instead. Sterling paused at the door, glancing back one last time. Impressive work, Evelyn. If you ever want to sit on a board that actually values knowledge, give me a call. He left, and the library was suddenly empty of everyone but the two of us. The mansion of cold luxury felt different now. The air was clearing. The stripping of the crown was complete. So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at my son, who was now slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, by forcing me to become the shark because they mistook my grace for a doormat. Did they really think I had become that senile, that I wouldn't recognize when it was time to close the book. I walked to the trash bin in the corner of the room, the same one where he had thrown my library card that morning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old yellowed slip of cardstock, the key to the treasury, the key to my life. I set it on the mahogany desk, front and center. Then I took the black card, his plastic crown, and dropped it into the bin. It hit the bottom with a muffled thud. "My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian," I said, the closing moral line falling like a gavel in the silence. "It was the vault, and you just lost the right to stand at the door." The turnover was over, and the stripping was finished, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the hardworking mother. I was the sovereign of my own history. I walked out of the library, leaving Julian in the shadows of the empire he didn't know how to keep. My stride was fast, my heart was light, and the victory was finally mine. The silence of the Beacon Hill mansion no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a clean slate, a vast, echoing space, where the ghost of my son's arrogance had finally been exorcised. In the weeks following the stripping of the crown, the transformation of my life was as swift as it was absolute. I stood in the center of the foyer watching a team of professional movers carry out the last of the minimalist furniture, the jagged glass tables, and the velvet chairs that were designed for show rather than comfort. Julian's black card lifestyle was being hauled away in the back of a truck, destined for an auction house to settle the final remnants of his corporate debt. I had spent my entire life being hardworking and self-sacrificing, building a world that Julian thought he owned. Now, to the strategic intelligence I had cultivated in the quiet corners of the library was the only thing left standing. The consequence for Julian was a bitter, public pill. Without the digital treasury to buffer his failures, he had fallen further and faster than he ever thought possible. He was no longer the darling of the Boston elite. He was a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails in the very boardrooms where he once held delusions of power. He was bankrupt, his name stripped from the company, his reputation a charred ruin. "So this is how he thought it would end?" I whispered to the empty white walls. Did he really think I had become that senile, that I would let him sell my soul to pay for his pride? I received the too late apology on a Thursday morning. It wasn't a phone call. I had changed my number. It was a letter, hand-delivered to the gate. The handwriting was shaky, stripped of the bold, aggressive loops Julian used when he thought he was the master of the universe. "Mom, I'm living in a studio in Quincy. It's small and the heat doesn't work right. Sterling won't take my calls. No one will. I realize now that I was blinded by the pressure. I was wrong about the card. I was wrong about everything. Can we please talk? I have nothing left." I read the letter standing in the kitchen, the very spot where he had flicked my library card into the trash. I felt a twinge of the old ghost of sacrifice, the urge to reach out and pull him from the wreckage. But then I looked at the trash bin. I remembered the flick of his wrist. I remembered the disrespect in his voice when he told me I was baggage. I didn't reply. Some lessons can only be learned in the cold. Julian needed to understand that a black card is just a piece of metal, but a mother's grace is a sanctuary. And once you burn the sanctuary down, you have to live in the rain. My new horizon didn't involve this mansion. I didn't need 10,000 square feet of marble to prove I existed. I had already made the arrangements. I had donated the Beacon Hill house to the Boston Historical Society with a massive endowment from the digital treasury to turn it into a public research center and archive. The mansion of cold luxury was going to become a place of quiet wisdom for everyone. I moved my own life to a modest yet warm space, a small weather-beaten cottage on the coast of Maine, a few hours north of the city. The spatial contrast was a physical relief. Here, there was no marble, and there was only salt-scoured wood, the smell of wood smoke, and shelves upon shelves of books that I actually intended to read. I traded the plastic crown for a life of my own making. I used a portion of the bonds to establish the Evelyn Vance Scholarship for Archival Sciences, ensuring that more hardworking souls would have the tools to protect the truth. I was no longer a witness to my son's life. I was the architect of my own. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said to the wind as I stood on the rocky shore behind my new home. You've forgotten who built this empire, and you've forgotten that the most enduring assets aren't the ones you can swipe at a register. The pacing of my days changed. It was no longer the frantic, heart-pounding rhythm of a woman trying to keep a sinking ship afloat. It was a firm, decisive stride. I woke up to the sound of the ocean rather than the sound of a stock ticker. I ate my meals on a wooden table that didn't cost a fortune, but felt solid under my hands. The stripping of the crown hadn't just punished Julian. It had liberated me. I was 70 years old, and for the first time, I wasn't anyone's burden or clutter. I was a woman who had used the secret in the grain to buy back her soul. Julian was in the shadows now, a man who had to learn the value of $1 and the weight of a hand on a shovel. I hoped he would find his way, but I knew I couldn't be the one to guide him. He had to find his own library card. He had to discover his own truth. I sat on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, watching the sun dip below the Atlantic. The victory wasn't in the $40 million, and it was in the silence. It was in the knowledge that I had fought for my dignity and won. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian, I thought, a calm smile finally touching my lips. It was the vault, and the vault is closed. The new horizon was bright, salt-edged, and entirely mine. The archivist had finished her work. The willow was ready to rest. And as the stars began to poke through the main sky, I realized that the greatest treasure wasn't the bonds. It was the freedom to never have to prove my worth to a shark ever again. The day I burned Julian's final plea for money in my cast-iron stove was the first day I truly breathed the salt air of my own life. It is autumn now in Maine, the real autumn, where the wind smells of brine and wood smoke, and the trees don't just change color, they ignite. I am 70 years old, sitting on the porch of a cottage that smells of pine and old books, watching the Atlantic churn against the jagged rocks. In Boston, the mansion of cold luxury is now a public archive, its marble floors muffled by the footsteps of students and dreamers. Here, the only footsteps are mine, and they are steady, heavy with a peace I haven't known since before Julian was born. The final letter, the mail arrived this morning, tucked into the cedar box at the end of the dirt lane. Among the journals and the letters from the Evelyn Vance Scholarship recipients was a thin, cheap envelope with a Quincy postmark. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I have seen the too late apology 1,000 times in my career as an archivist. It is always written in the same ink of desperation and self-interest. Mom, the winter is coming, and the landlord says the heat in the studio isn't his problem. I'm working at a call center, Mom. Me, a Vance. People hang up on me all day. I think about the library card. I think about how I treated you. Please, I'm your son. Don't leave me in the cold. I watch the paper curl and blacken in the stove. I didn't feel the choking sorrow that used to define my relationship with him. I felt nothing but a cool, clinical detachment. And I had spent 40 years shielding him from the cold, only for him to try and lock me out of my own home. So this is how he repays me, I whispered to the crackling flames. By asking for the warmth of a fire he tried to extinguish. Did he really think I had become that senile, that I would mistake his need for his love? The philosophical audit. I sat back in my chair, the salvaged 1974 library card resting on the table beside me. It is framed now, a small square of yellowed paper that serves as a reminder of the secret in the grain. Looking back, I realized that the Dignity Rise formula isn't just about reclaiming money. It's about reclaiming the narrative of one's own life. And I have spent the last few months reflecting on what it means to be a willow in a world that worships the oak. The bending is not breaking. Julian thought my quiet wisdom and self-sacrificing nature were signs of a weak trunk. He didn't realize that the willow survives the hurricane because it knows how to yield to the wind while its roots hold the earth. The hidden asset of time. The most enduring assets are not the ones you can swipe or display. They are the ones you build in the dark, the knowledge, the preparation, and the patience. The power of the record. In the end, a man is only as good as the archives he leaves behind. Julian left a record of greed and plastic crowns. I left a record of work and steel. The final reckoning of the soul. Julian's black card is likely in a landfill now. A piece of dead titanium that couldn't buy him a single friend when the stripping of the crown was complete. He thought power was a loud voice in a boardroom and a materialistic display of dominance. He forgot that the person who categorizes the history of the world is the one who eventually gets to write the ending. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said to the empty room, my voice firm and decisive, carrying the weight of a woman who has finally won. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that the hand that shelves the books is the same hand that can close the ledger for good. I am no longer the hardworking ghost of Beacon Hill. I am the sovereign of the Maine coast. My days are filled with the quiet wisdom of the tides and the strategic intelligence of a woman who knows exactly how much she is worth. I do not miss the marble. I do not miss the cold luxury. I miss the woman I used to be, the one who thought she had to suffer to be loved. But I am so glad she finally found the library card that led her home. The moral of the archive. If you are reading this, or if you are the one standing in the kitchen while your past is thrown in the trash, remember the old library card. Knowledge and quiet preparation are the most enduring assets. Do not fear the silence. Do not fear the gray hair or the dust of your profession. The sharks in the boardroom think they own the water, but they have no idea how deep the ocean actually goes. I walked out onto the porch as the sun began to dip below the Atlantic horizon. The world was purple and gold, a regal setting for a woman who had finally found her own crown. The turnover was finished. The new horizon was mine. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian, I thought, the closing moral line falling like the final page of a long, difficult book. It was the vault, and the vault is closed forever. I turned back toward the warmth of my cottage, the library card glowing in its frame, a small, humble key that had unlocked the greatest treasure of all, the freedom to be exactly who I am, without apology and without the weight of an ungrateful son. The willow was standing tall. The storm was over, and for the first time in 70 years, the silence was perfect.